The story we heard in last week's gospel, the feeding of the multitudes, probably took place on the hills above the Sea of Galilee, the body of water we heard about in today's gospel. The temperature at the top of the hills was much cooler than the temperature down by the sea because of the wet and the water and the warmth. Those barometric and atmospheric contrasts probably contributed to the storm that we heard about in today's gospel. After the revival meeting, where thousands of children and women and men were fed both spiritually and physically by Jesus, Jesus told his disciples to meet him on the other side of the lake. He would catch up to them a little bit later. As we know, and as the story goes, the disciples were in this boat, and a storm occurred in the middle of the lake. The blurry-eyed disciples, they were very tired, they were hungry, and now because of the storm, they surely thought they were going to drown. And lo and behold, they look up and they see Jesus coming at them walking on the water. He assured them, however, "Don't worry, you have nothing to be afraid of. Everything's going to be all right." Well, Peter trusted Jesus, and immediately he jumped into the lake, and we now know that Peter was not a very good swimmer. And so he started to sink, and maybe he sank because he wasn't aware of his own strengths, his own capabilities. There are a lot of us who are not sure of our own strengths and our own capabilities in life, and so we become afraid. But at least Peter tried to embrace Jesus. He reached out to Jesus because he trusted in Jesus, while the other disciples, they were in the boat. They were worried about their own lives. Today, you and I cannot afford to sit comfortably in the boat. Sink or swim. That's what great numbers of people in this country are faced with, a problem exacerbated by the pandemic. We've heard so much about the pandemic, but we can't tire of it. We must be on high alert because the pandemic is not over. Still, people are suffering. The executive orders and memoranda that were signed yesterday attempt to extend unemployment benefits, attempt to suspend payroll taxes, and offer federal eviction and student loan relief. Excluded were the weekly stimulus checks that so many people have counted on up to now. Excluded was funding for SNAP and Medicaid programs, those programs that keep so many of our families healthy today. Also excluded was monies to help reopen our schools safely. A sinking feeling comes when you're out of a job and grocery bills and rent and mortgage payments begin to pile up. And those who are on fixed incomes also worry. What's important to us today is to understand that sometimes the tides are so strong that getting to the other side of the lake to reach the rapidly vanishing American land of milk and honey, the land of the dreams, is impossible, especially for people who are of color. Even if you do manage to get to the other shore, fierce hurricane winds are tearing apart mountains of dreams, and political, economic, and virus-related earthquakes are shattering visions of a stable and peaceful world. In the first reading, we heard that the prophet Elijah could not find God in such powerful forces of nature, hurricanes, earthquakes, and firestorms. God was not in those. Those forces of nature are very much like those things that distract us today because of the implosion of all the news that we're getting and the struggle to figure out which is right and which is wrong, what's the truth and what's the not the truth. Social media today, we're tethered to our phones and our TVs and our iPads. Those are the distractions where it is going to be hard to hear and find the voice of God. God did come to Elijah. God whispered in Elijah's ear, quietly telling him how to get help to lead the troubled Israelites to a promised land, to a place where they would be safe and secure. God came quietly and whispered in Elijah's ear. We have to be still in order to listen to what God is telling us, how God is helping us survive in troubling days. Matthew's gospel draws our attention to the demands of discipleship. Jesus was prepping his disciples to go out on their missions and told them, don't be afraid of what's out there. As baptized members of this church, you and I, disciples of Christ, must open our ears to hear God whispering to us, telling you, telling me what to do. This is important for us to take the lead. We are expected to have a calming effect on today's raging seas. I know this is a familiar and nagging challenge for you and for me. We hear about it all the time, and many of us have our own problems, our own fears, our own sicknesses. We have people in our families who are dying, who are very sick. We can't visit relatives. I have a brother who has Alzheimer's. I haven't been able to see him in the nursing home for 3 months. And so we often doubt our strength and our abilities to swim against the tides that are encroaching upon us. Now, some interpreters of the Bible say that the unsteady boat in this gospel is a metaphor for the church. The storm symbolizes the persecutions of early Jewish Christians, Matthew's target audience. Although Catholicism, our religion, has weathered many storms over the centuries, today we are a ship in troubled waters. We have to get our strength together. We need to navigate many issues like pedophilia, married clergy, ordination of women, patriarchal leadership styles, dwindling parish memberships, and perhaps above all, finding some common ground on ethical issues. We Catholics do not agree on every social issue. And on top of these intramural concerns, you and I are still summoned to take our gospel message into the streets. And there we will find that large numbers of people continue to hover in the alleyways of exclusionary social systems. Our American caste structure fosters cultures of injustice and self-righteousness. These separations are so ingrained in this nation's DNA that they are becoming harder and harder to challenge and to change. And we oftentimes don't think about it because we're so used to the systems that we abide by in this country. And we cannot overlook another stormy but timely lesson from history. This past week on August 6th and today, August 9th, marked the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You and I want to believe that that was the last time that such weapons would ever be used on humanity. The virus is wreaking havoc on humanity, but the threat of technological and nuclear holocausts also haunt us. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we took a city bus out to the memorial site, and sitting across from me was an elderly Japanese man, and we caught each other's eye and we nodded to one another. And I couldn't but help think, as I'm sitting there, a white American male, what might be going on in his mind. And with all due respect to Pearl Harbor and the many, many veterans, the men and women who fought in World War II, I couldn't but help feel embarrassed and mournful as I looked at that Japanese gentleman who probably either survived the bombing or had relatives who did. The United States bishops just last week reminded us that we are witnessing geopolitical conflicts with state and non-state actors. That's the American bishop speaking. They tell us about increasingly sophisticated weaponry and the erosion of international arms control networks. And now Congress, as you probably know, wants to fund nuclear testing readiness, allowing the moratorium on nuclear testing to expire early next year. That means that there is the possibility, again, of using nuclear weapons. And yet the Atomic Scientist newsletter tells us that we must tell our government officials that nuclear weapons do not create safety or security. They diminish them and threaten humanity's future. So you and I gather in this holy place on Sunday to worship God. We don't want to hear bad news, and yet bad news is all around us. You can't avoid it. The question for you and for me is, what does God's word say to us in these times of trouble, in these times of raging storms? And like Elijah, we need to listen to God, who whispers in our own ears to reinforce the gifted foundations of faith, hope, and love that we have. This is not a time for us to tread water or just sit in the boat. We Christians must join with other faith traditions to swim forward without fear, to end the ecological destruction of humanity, animal life, and this planet. We cannot leave anyone in our wake. So what is it that is stirring in our lives that requires acting beyond our own fears? Maybe there's something gnawing at us inside our stomachs, challenging us to take a bold step forward in the face of all these anxieties. Just maybe this is the time for you and for me to let go of whatever it is that's holding us back from jumping into the water, swimming with all of our strength, trusting that the God of all creation will somehow guide us safely home.